known to most or all of you in one form or another. And I think, you guys changed the order of your seating, but that's okay, I know who you are. So on the far left, Richard Steenburgen of NLayer is a notorious IP hijacker himself. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just making this stuff up as I go along. I'm sorry, I'm waiting for people to stream it. But no, Richard has given some of the more technical and more consistently interesting presentations at NANOG over the years. They're a gold mine of history in the archives. His presentations are always valuable for years after the fact. And it's a testament to the value of offering presenters free admission to NANOG, because he's a notoriously cheap person. Person is the nice, and really only comes to NANOG when he can get in for free, and he always comes to NANOG, so we usually get something good out of him. Next is on his right is Larry Blanc of Merit. Larry is on the program committee as well, engineers much of the network that you're using today, is responsible for the IPv6 NAT PT stuff not working. He personally wrote the code that doesn't work, I believe. No, that was Cisco, I'm sorry, just kidding there. To his right is Warren Kumari of Google. To his right is Rüdiger Volk of Deutsche Telekom. He's prepared to take all manner of questions about their peering policies and the total amount of traffic to the /10 that bothers you guys so much. There'll be detailed discussions about that, I'm positive. And then to his right, Danny McPherson of Arbor Networks. Danny has done an enormous amount of work over the years, and certainly for this NANOG, on the security content that we've had here. So we appreciate that greatly. So without ado, turn it over to Danny.
Great. Thanks, Todd. So yeah, it was kind of funny because when on the YouTube thing came up and Martin presented this earlier, and a couple of folks are like, well, let's have another route filtering panel. I was like, well, we could just, they archive the video now, so we could just play the video from the last 5 route filtering panels and not actually have to do it again. But what we changed with this is a little more focus on, sort of why people stopped using IRRs and stopped doing some of the route filtering, what the challenges are, and then dig into some things that are changing and what might make it a little more appealing and a little more useful to start doing some of the route filtering stuff and that kind of thing. So the guys I got here, it's a pretty wide spectrum of organizations represented, right? Some IRR folks and content and different providers, and someone that's written a couple of tools, or a couple of folks that have written tools along these lines. And so we got a pretty broad spectrum, and this is definitely meant to be interactive. We got a few slides to kind of set the stage, and then I got some sort of questions for the panel members. At any point, if you got questions or clarifications, you're welcome to go ahead and come to the mic. We've got slightly less than an hour now to use for this. Larry, by the way, I asked Larry if he would join us yesterday, and so I appreciate him kind of on a whim stepping up, as well as Warren standing in for Chris Moreau, who had to leave early. So I appreciate Warren stepping up as well. So anyway, with that, so I just said this actually. We're going to talk primarily about the route advertisements and the contents of these updates themselves, and the prefixes explicitly, not really about protecting BGP sessions from DOS attacks or from from that sort of thing. So we're not really dealing with transport connection stuff. We're just going to talk about the content and the prefixes. So, in the last 15 years, what's changed, right? More stale IRR data, right? Less employment of inter-provider filtering in particular, but also customer filtering. Still no verifiable source. So one of the long-term problems that's existed, or part of the chicken and egg problem, is the fact that that on the internet, right, we have all these RIRs and some IN allocated stuff, and there's really no authoritative, formally verifiable source for who owns what IP address space. So if you want to do things like anti-spoofing, or if you want to do route filters, how do you verify that the content is correct and hasn't been altered or modified in some way, and what's changing with that? So a lot more meat computers behind keyboards, right? So people with BGP router enable access, 15 years ago, there were maybe 5,000. Now, you got maybe 500,000 people with enable access. And, and therefore, the probability of mistakes in particular is much, much higher. Greater reliance on internet availability. I mean, when Africa Kenya Online, went off, offline for, for 22 hours or whatever, just after YouTube, there wasn't a lot of attention to that. But when YouTube went offline, it was a big deal. So, we need the availability of this stuff. There actually are critical applications that, and lots of e-commerce and money flowing because of internet availability. So it's much more critical. So anyway, in summary, things have just got worse in the last 15 years. They haven't gotten better. So the IRRs, what are some of the issues? I think Larry was saying that there are 37, 35 IRRs now? 34 IRRs. So we have less IRRs now just because ISPs went out of business, or I don't know, what were some of the other reasons for this?
Yeah, primarily ISPs going out of business or losing interest. They just stopped maintaining their servers and let them die off. So I think that's the primary reason.
So, I mean, so we have less IRRs today now rather than more IRRs and more stealth data, certainly. We'll talk some more about that in just a minute. Certainly the fact that there are 35 or to 50 IRs, whatever the number is, and that's a challenge, right? This is where you register your route policy and what routes you're going to originate and who you're going to provide transit or other routing policy for. So that's certainly a challenge. So perception is the data in the IRs is useless, right? We're going to get to that in a minute. Customer issues. So Rudiger was actually mentioning something like they have customers with 20,000 routes, and they don't want to register them, or they want to register them in 5 different places. I don't know. You want to expand on that now? Should we wait?
Well, not really.
No. So all right, we'll get to it in a minute. Then that's fine. Insecure update model. One of the big things is that there's very little security wrapped around the IR update models, right? So the fact that anyone can pretty much go update any IR anywhere with whatever prefix, and if someone correlates all this decentralized data and builds policy based on this, they don't really apply preference to one IR over another, or they have no way to formally verify who owns what address space. All right, tools to configure the IRs. So like Richard's worked on some, I know Larry has. A lot of ISPs have their own tools, and so so what's there, what's missing, and how can you improve that? Inter-IR communication, just talked about this a minute ago. Timing issues. So there used to be these issues all the time, like when it was Internet MCI in '94, where when you added a route, a new customer, you turn them up, or they were multi-home, you started announcing something, you would add it to your registry, and we push out new configs with the tool and update prefix list and announce the route. And then everybody else was filtering the route, and so we'd have to call them up and say, hey, can you remove your filter? Then you'd have to bounce the route because BGP is reliable transport, and it doesn't just resend the route, so you have to bounce it. But we're going to talk about some protocol stuff there. And then full route policy enumeration. Again, this is something Rudiger brought up, where the fact that like a lot of ISPs, for example, in Russia, some of the ISPs back one another up completely. And so it's like, if this link goes down, then they have to list all the other prefixes in some registry, and this guy is a potential transit provider, so people can build filters on that. And then, all right, we're going to skip past this. So I don't know how many folks here were familiar with Nemesis. When I went digging for some stuff, one of the things that was interesting to me is what's sort of the delta from RAR allocations to IRR object, route object registration to the routing system. And Nemesis did some of this stuff. And, RIPE was pretty good. A lot of the other data was challenging, either because it was stale and routes were registered, or people just left them and so forth. So, some tools to understand these things and see how we get it cleaned up are important. This is just kind of a conceptual model where, where route allocation occurs. And you got this, sort of this chunk on the right side here. The purple stuff doesn't actually exist yet. That's what Mark Kosters was talking about and what Rudiger was talking about earlier. That's being developed. And that's sort of this RPKI thingy, right, is this authoritative source that's never existed for who actually owns what and who's authorized to originate what. And so if you have that, that's a big part of the chicken and egg problem, and then you can start using that to either provide preference or provide other things. And so you can, there's a more plausible path to, to formally verifiable route filters. So this just says what I just said, some routing protocol issues. So some of the things that had changed too is, I was mentioning you had to bounce a route when you updated a policy and you had to call someone, like we used to call ANS, they would filter all their peers, say, hey, we just added this, can you remove, or update your policies based on these new IRR objects, and they do that. And then you have to either reset the session with the customer, reset the sessions with ANS, or literally, announce announce that prefix with a more preferred path, find some way to bounce the route in BGP so that there would be a reissue of that update. And with things like BGP route refresh, you don't have to do that anymore. There are some implementation issues and so forth, but some of these things that were challenges and were reasons people stopped using IRRs and explicit prefix filtering don't exist anymore from that perspective. Router issues. So, you know, where do things break, right? I mean, if you got, you know, 2,000 prefixes for, or, you know, in an access list for customers, then, you know, that might be reasonable. But if you have 500,000, you know, which you know, is perfectly, you know, plausible today, then, you know, is it going to break your routers? Is it going to load configs? You're going to have, you know, write issues or config loading, or is it sessions going to reset? You know, what's going to break there? So, policy language. So, if you're using things like, say, black hole communities, do you have to define, you know, multiple sets of policies? So, for example, it's like, I'm going to transit these explicit prefixes and these prefixes only. And by the way, if there's a more specific prefix that exists with this community, it's going to black hole that route, but I don't want to transit it. So you got to define 2 or 3 or 4 sets of overlapping policies. So how do you express that, and how is it actually implemented? Processing load, utilization, config loads, all this stuff, data path. So can this stuff, you know, do you have to duplicate these routing filters for data path filters, right? And if you do, now you've got 2x the number of you know, amount of configuration or more. So, and then, you know, the application of this. So if I configure these things, you know, are they immediately applied, or is it all loaded and committed at one time, and, you know, and so forth, so you don't leak routes, or depending on how your policy is implemented, you know, it varies between vendors, and so this causes route stability issues on the internet. Bottlenecks. Richard actually mentioned, I left this placeholder in here, but you mentioned a slide. I don't know if you want to talk for a minute, but I think Tom Scholl had a slide a couple of nanogs ago, or a couple of years ago, that said something about where routers broke, and you know, some of the testing that he did. And you know, it's important to understand, right, because there are all these different touch pieces, and it's like, if you're going to actually implement prefix filtering, then, you know, where are the gating, you know, the gates at? General filtering. All right, you know what, I'm going to skim past all this because I'm doing all the talking. So, all right, panel and community quests, right? So, and I encourage all of you, right, if you're sitting in the room, you probably care about some route getting hijacked somewhere. So if you got comments, but I'm going to direct these to the guys at the table here, and see, you know, see what the thoughts are with some of these questions. So, incremental deployment, right? So if you have things like Nemesis to diff route, you know, I mean, how stale are the IRRs basically, and what tools and capabilities do you need to, you know, to get to a place where the IRs are feasible to do both customer base and inter-provider, you know, filtering. Any comments on that? I don't know if Larry or Richard or anyone's done any analysis on this. Put you on the spot here.
Well, I would just say that the current use of IRs is for customer-based filtering. So while there is, you know, a considerable amount of stale data in there, since you're just looking at customer peers, a lot of that data is not really relevant. You're looking at AS numbers and doing inverse lookups based on AS numbers. So the fact that there's prefixes registered with old AS numbers isn't terribly relevant for doing customer filtering. Now, of course, if you want to go beyond that, then that's a big issue. But the way it's being used right now, I mean, it's semi-functional. I mean, you can talk to Level 3 or Savis. I mean, those guys are using it. And from their perspective, it's certainly not, it's not adequate, but it works.
Objection, Your Honor. Even if you just intend to filter based on the reverse AS lookup, the stale data that people proxy registered with wrong origin over the last decade, that is around a couple of the databases, of course, is reason for concern. But well, okay. So I think the fact that there are databases out where, well, okay, there is absolutely no security that really goes after authenticity and authority. Well, okay, and there is bad practice about putting stuff in, like, well, okay, the party that puts stuff in is some higher level transit provider who just does lots of proxy stuff and never cleans up. Of course, is of concern, and well, okay, this for me means that, well, okay, when using the IRR data, I consider it an important thing to actually be very selective. If a customer tells me that, well, okay, he is unfortunately using a routing registry with little security, but he tells me, well, okay, that's the place where I am actually publishing my stuff. And I put into my database that, well, okay, for that guy, I will be querying exactly that database and not pick up all the stuff that is floating around the other, how many? 50 registries? Well, okay, yeah, whatever the number is. I think I can argue that I'm doing a much more reasonable job than just accepting all the stuff that's around. And anyway, well, if you are providing transit service for just a small number of small customers, well, okay, actually, Larry's approach may be fine. But well, okay, if you are someone like PCCW, did they occur in recent slides? Well, okay, you are actually providing service for a large number of prefixes with multiple level of transit in between, collecting the right prefixes out of the current mess of registries, quite certainly is something that does not make it very successful.
Okay, so I don't know, Richard. Yeah, you want to comment on this one?
So I haven't actually done any analysis on how much stale data is out there, but in my experience, there's a lot of stale data, and it comes from multiple sources. It comes from things like companies that have been defunct that used to have some IP space, had it registered, and the IP space has now been reclaimed, reassigned to somebody else. There's still registrations for that. You see a lot of times now that ASNs have been reclaimed and recycled. There's faulty origin information out there. So there's routes that have absolutely no association with you that are floating around in these registries. And probably the biggest one that I've seen is people that don't clean up their AS sets. So, for example, you might have a large network who has customers, and these people, they're motivated to put data into the system. No one complains when the prefix list allows too much. People complain when the prefix list doesn't allow enough. So as long as the routes propagate, no one seems to go look and realize that they're including AS sets for people that are not their customers. Many orders of magnitude down, many layers down, and if you actually go expand some of these AS sets, I can think of several offhand that you can go out and expand, and they will just generate massive hundreds of thousands of prefixes that they don't announce and that they're never going to announce. Right. And there's no process to go clean that up. And then when you take into account the number of registries that are out there, the number of people that are doing proxy registrations, I've had people do proxy registration for me for routes that exist in the table. Or, for example, if for any reason one day I might announce a more specific, and someone picks it up and proxy registers it for me, and I've had to send many emails to people and say, knock it off. There's a lot of people that don't know that things are being proxy registered for them, don't know that things are being proxy registered 4 or 5 times, and there's some people that will proxy register without actually checking to see if the route exists there or not. So you literally will find all these different ISPs, especially many of them running their own IRR servers that go out and just populate data however they willy-nilly want, and there's no accountability for that data.
Go ahead, Todd. You got a question?
Hello.
Okay. Todd Underwood, Renaissance. So I think it was yesterday or the day before when my colleague Martin was talking about the L-root nonsense. One of the things he proposed, not in very great detail, was that the root server operators operate a very small IRR for the root prefixes, which would contain the routing policy for what AS should. I mean, we found it surprisingly difficult to find any official documentation, i.e. we never found any official documentation on what ASs should originate which root prefixes, right, and what are the authorized upstreams or peers or left-hand side ASs for those. Do you guys think that A, would that help? B, is that a reasonable thing to do? C, will any root server operators actually do that?
So you want to talk about RPKI or about the IRR?
Well,
where do you want to go with this?
Yeah, well, okay, kind of. Creating another, going from N registries to N+1 where, well, okay, this new one is supposed to be, well, okay, having really nice data and well cared for. Well, okay, it could help, but well, okay, is it actually a way for, reasonable forward?
So what I'm going to ask along these lines actually is, if you have this extra registry, it is another registry. If there's not an authoritative source for who's authorized to originate which prefixes, then people have to define implicit models where they deny those prefixes, you know, like these golden networks or platinum prefixes or whatever. You have to deny those from everyone else and just accept them from, you know, rather than an explicit sort of, you know, security model for route announcements, which says, these are the explicit prefixes I'm accepting from these origin ASs, and I'm denying everything else. And so I don't know, what are sort of thoughts on, you know, sort of golden prefixes or doing things in the interim to, yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, okay. I think for really going forward and not just trying to fix the whole globe by applying square foot patches. Actually, the problem of, well, okay, how can we get to a storage of good data that everybody who cares about and cares about his address space can use to deposit the authorization information, and everybody who cares to run a clean network can actually go and pick it up. And assuming we would have such a storage, well, okay, actually, what Danny was saying is gets possible, namely to actually do root origin validation by filtering even between the higher tier peerings. Yeah, of course, if all the 100,000 routes that really should be in the routing system get registered, we'll put some strain on the routers and the router configuration in particular. But well, okay, that's not going to happen this fast. And well, okay, overall, looking at the whole problem, I think for getting good routing security, well, okay, there are two preconditions. One is to have good data where, well, okay, everybody knows to store the stuff, everybody knows to read it, and, well, okay, there are also tools to access it. The second point is, well, okay, in the end, really secure routing will only happen when we get security elements in the routing protocol. As long as we are not there, well, okay, we are emulating the stuff, approximating this by creating more complex policies in the routing. And, well, okay, if we get good data, well, okay, we can feed the policies to do it.
Right. So to shift gears slightly, you know, I would posit, I guess, or you know, say that every ISP today, there's no excuse for why you shouldn't explicitly filter what route announcements, I mean, what announcements your customers, what prefixes your customers announce to you. So, you know, when we discussed this yesterday, right, it's like, you know, it's like, so if you generate this based on IRRs and it's somebody that's multi-homed, whose registry they use, all these sort of things. But I think that, you know, a basic responsibility of every ISP today is that they should at least filter their customers. So what are thoughts on that? Start over with Richard.
Well, obviously they should, and the problem is, you know, at hand is why aren't they? And there's plenty of excuses why, there's plenty of reasons why things are difficult to do. At the end of the day, the answer is you have to do it, you must do it, no matter how hard it is. And if there's a problem with doing it, then that's a problem you need to solve. But at the same time, I can name any number of networks out there who are both my peers and in one case even a transit provider who doesn't prefix filter me, they max filter me. I could announce anything I want and probably get it propagated right now. And that's probably true for a lot of people in this room.
Yep. So Larry, you have any thoughts on that from?
Well, I think it's clear that some of the tools out there are far too complex. The IRR tool set, to name one, it requires quite a bit of effort to get that set up and working. and the registry systems are fairly complicated. For the RADB, we have a web front end, but it's still more complex than we'd like it to be, and I'm sure that more complex than our users would like it to be. And part of the issue is we're not really sure where IRRs are going, and we haven't really gotten a lot of feedback. And 3 or 4 years ago, people were fairly certain within Merit that they were going to die off, that this SOBGP and SPGP stuff was going to come out, and people weren't going to use IRRs anymore. So there wasn't a lot of investment put into the RADB or the IRR system. So I think there needs to be some decision going forward. Do we want to continue to use IRRs on an interim basis? Should there be a, our pricing right now for the RADB, we do charge $250 a year, but that's just for keeping the servers up, maintaining the software. It doesn't allow a lot of development in terms of user interfaces and things like that. So, we could increase the fees, but then you're going to lose customers. So it's not really going to bring in much revenue if you want to do enhancements.
Warren, what are your thoughts on both that, and I should have asked Richard, but on, is there any notion of including in like peering agreements, for example, for those of you that do peering or are involved with the agreements, that your peers must explicitly filter customers. You have really no way to verify that until somebody screws something up. But Warren, both on both those questions, do you think it's reasonable to say that if an ISP doesn't filter their customers explicitly today, and I realize most of accidents happen, but do you think it's reasonable to say that every ISP should filter their customers?
Well, it's really hard to get customers to put information into the IRRs. And registering the information for them, so proxy registering, doesn't really gain you anything. Because when a customer calls up and says, this is my space, there's no way to validate that it really is their space. This used to belong to this friend of mine, he gave it to me, it's my space now, I can register it.
So back to
There's
that egg
very
part of
little you can
this
do at that
central
point.
authority for, okay.
Well,
When
I
they're-
think, you sort of have to look at the threat models. Right now, I think the main concern is the accidental hijacks. So we talk about authority models, and well, there's really no authority for registering these prefixes, but I don't think it's a huge concern, having somebody go out and spoof something and register something to try to hijack it. You don't really see that. So the main threat model is preventing the accidental hijacks, the YouTube incident.
Sure, but you don't see.
So to say, oh, we can't register, or we shouldn't register because there's no authority model, I think that's kind of dodging the issue at this point. Once you get to the point where you have more registrations and a better system, then you clearly need to focus on that. But I don't really see that as a valid excuse for not registering.
So Richard, do you have
from a computer scientist point of view, people are horrified by this, but if you're just looking at preventing those accidental hijacks, it will prevent those.
Well, I'll tell you, I've never had a single customer of mine come to me and say, well, I'm not going to register IRR because it's not really that secure anyways. They say, I'm not going to register an IRR because what the hell is this and how do I use it?
Right.
So that one thing I did want to do is put in a plug for a piece of software that I wrote called IRR Power Tools, which I did specifically because the official toolset, IRR toolset, doesn't compile on any GCC that's been written in the last 5 years, for example, on any modern OS. So I started from scratch and wrote an entirely clean code base that will run on any modern system. And you can find it. I did a NANOG presentation on this. If you go search the archives, it's back to last Dallas NANOG. And you can find it on SourceForge, totally free. Search for IRRPT. And this is a system that any ISP can use regardless of their size, scope, clue level. I've got tier 1s using this, and they come to me for questions sometimes, and I try to fix the software. I've got very small ISPs using this, and it seems to work relatively well, and it combines the aspects of automating, pulling down the prefix lists, sorting them, aggregating them, running them against known bogons that you want to exclude, tracking changes over time, so you've got like a CVS history that you can go back and see when someone registered the route, and prefix generation for all the different types of routers out there, Juniper, Cisco, Foundry, Force 10, et cetera, Extreme, and even some hooks to help tie that into your backend databases and then push those routes out. So it's the best starting point that I've got to offer, and I definitely want to make changes. So anyone that runs that and has any suggestions, please submit them, but otherwise I would encourage anyone that's not filtering their customers to at least try this because it's really simple.
Good. So let's go to David, and then I'm going to come back to Ruger. You got a comment, David?
Yeah, I wanted to point out the possible incremental benefit that every ISP knows who their customers are because they're receiving checks from them. So they have a valid set of contact information. They have a valid set of something, some way to contact them. And if the ISPs run their own server that then will say at least here's who we are and here's who our customers are, then at least that can be part of that provides an incremental benefit. Incremental benefit to the rest of the community going forward, even though it's not in full compliance with the public IRR model, and it can be brought into yet another data source for the full IRR set.
So Rudiger, you want to respond to that and then comment on the other questions, or either way?
Well, okay, I somewhat got lost on that. So let me bounce back first to Warren. Well, okay, Warren, you said, well, okay, it's impossible to actually check. Well, there is a difference between very expensive and impossible.
Okay.
And well, okay, of course, expensive is something that we usually do not like to do, and well, okay, the more interesting thing is, well, okay, can we actually enforce that really things get registered? And well, okay, if someone actually has his own address space that he obviously is using PI, well, okay, actually we have to tell the community that running PI has its cost. And actually, if you want to run PI and be secured from hijacking, well, okay, you actually have to pay the cost. And well, okay, if you are a dentist and have your expertise in a different field, well, okay, you may need to actually get someone who for a charge or whatever actually takes care of the thing. So within my environment, actually, I'm kind of used to say, well, okay, at least, well, okay, our main focus is still on the European market. There, it actually works to tell someone who comes up and says, please route this address space. We tell them, well, okay, get it. We will be fine if you prepare the authorization within the RIPE routing registry so that we actually have it registered. And if this is not possible, well, okay, it's not possible to get it routed. Well, okay, I'm back in the back office as an architect, and I'm quite happy. We have other departments that do the front-end handling of customers, and well, okay, obviously, providing a helping hand in some way there may be a very important requirement for the current situation and very likely for any upcoming new situation. Okay, so far for the checking of authority. And well, okay, things get really interesting with the authority when you actually have multi-level of customers. And that may be actually one point for Dave. Well, okay, I may know my immediate Russian customer, but what the hell do I know about all the Russian providers that obviously are providing mutual transit for fallback? I have no way to deal with it unless on the leaf of the whole structure things are registered. And if that happens in a way that I can pull out, I can install filters, and well, okay, doing the filters comes with the cost of having the right tools, making them operational and actually using them. Okay, other topic. Larry was saying, well, okay, the way forward about using IRRs got unclear. And, well, okay, in the current situation, I certainly would agree a lot on it, and I think it's a really interesting question whether, well, okay, anybody who isn't doing the right thing at the moment should spend effort in using the tools that are available for RPSL and around the routing registries. Now, I have the good news that, well, okay, again, the essential first prerequisite for any kind of secure routing is to have good data in a place where everybody knows to store it there and everybody knows to pull it. Couple of years of efforts in working on providing infrastructure for this good data has been done under the name of RPKI. And it seems that we are getting really close to seeing this finished and become available. And looking closely at what information we'll get in the RPKI, we can find out that the information we would like to use in our policies and are very, very simple, straightforward, mapped into RPSL constructs that can use the infrastructure we have with routing registries and RPSL tools. And, well, okay, this can be done in a way so that, well, okay, whoever has something in place doesn't need to change any of the tools.
Right. So let me actually stop you there for just a second. So, and go back to Richard and Warren in particular. If, you know, this RPKI thing, for example, you know, as we said when we started, is one of sort of the root issues is the chicken and egg, and the fact that there's never existed a formally verifiable or trustworthy, formally verifiable source for who owns what IP address on the internet. So if that exists, which is under the auspices of this RPKI thing, and that's used for, you know, constructing, you know, IR, you know, basic IR route origination information, how does that change the equation? I mean, is it then reasonable to expect everyone to filter everyone else? And I mean, does that change your perspective? I know Richard was already along the lines that they should be, but, you know, is that like a game change? To me, it's like the fact that this is going to exist and it's never existed before provides a huge infrastructure that enables this. So comments on that?
Currently, I've had cases where I've called up an ISP and said, this is my space, I'm going to announce it. And they say, is it really your space? And I say, yes. And they say, oh, okay, no worries, we'll announce it for you, no worries.
That's the three-phase verification, yeah. I got you, okay.
If I could say, this is my space, and they say, oh, look, we've got this thing that says it isn't your space, so we're not going to believe you, that would definitely change the game.
And, you know, the tool sets, obviously, right? The tools that have existed for IRRs and like Richard's stuff, for example. I mean, all these things should be automated, right? This shouldn't be something that's a manual process and somebody has to type it in, or I mean, and there's a lot of free stuff out there to do this. One of the big challenges is like the routing infrastructure. So what about your routers today? You know, any of you want to comment on, you know, on what your router vendors should be doing to get ready for this? If this is really going to change the game and allow people to filter, you know, how skeptical are you that you can even implement this kind of policy today?
Well, I personally think that the router vendors at this point should have some kind of protocol to be efficiently loading these prefixes, short of us writing silly expect scripts to log into routers to push these changes. It needs to happen at some point. It needs to be more efficient in how it's loaded and how it's processed. But even if you have the RPKI implementation, like I said, I've never had anyone come to me and say, well, I don't do IRR because it's not really that secure. People can't figure it out, and that's the bottom line. If we've designed a system that is so complicated that we can't get people to generate a list of the prefixes they're going to announce, how hard is this? It's a list of numbers. It's a short list of numbers. You associate it with your AS, and then your ISP associates your AS with their AS. How hard is this? How have we designed a protocol that is so nasty that a significant percentage of the population can't figure this out?
So how do you change that then? How do I mean, that's one of the fundamental issues. If people aren't going to implement based on this, then how do you change that expectation?
I think the problem comes from we've written a policy language that allows you to specify anything and everything, and it's so complex that no one's willing to take on the challenge of handling any part of it because they have to handle every possible case of it. And my point would be to develop software the way that I did with IRRPT, which is to only address the common use case. My common use case is I have routes that are associated with an auth-num, which is associated with an AS set, which I pull down and generate prefixes. That's it. I don't need to describe every local pref policy, every med policy, every import policy, every person that I peer with. And most people, from the people that I've talked to, especially in the U.S., don't want to do any more than that. Don't want to go into any detail. And there needs to be a better front-end system into that. There needs to be something Web 2.0-y that people can go, here's my AS. Okay, I verified that this is my AS by it sends an email to the technical contact, and I get that and I respond. Okay, prefix enter, prefix enter, prefix enter. I need to delete a prefix, click, submit. How hard can this be?
Well, okay. Pointing back to Larry's question, how much sense does it make to spend effort on routing registry stuff? I would say, well, okay, spending effort in improving the user interface to the RPSL is not buying us anything. It is a challenge to go after the people who are installing the RPKI and building the interfaces for service providers and, in the end, customers for creating the new secure data. Looking at the long time people have spent in building the RPKI, we can see dealing with all of this is a challenge. But well, okay, I think the only reasonable way forward for getting better is to make sure that the chance of getting good data gets support by adequate user interfaces. And well, okay, I think, Danny, you started with the question, well, okay, what uptake can we expect of the RPKI stuff?
I think that's a great question.
And well, okay, I think we will not have any uptake if the data doesn't get used immediately, because nobody will be willing to go through the pain of doing it if there is no immediate benefit, like seeing the damned prefix routed. And well, okay, so kind of waiting until the routing protocols can actually make use of it means that we will wait until we get the chicken and egg problem.
So let me stop you. Let me ask you this question. To your point, is there any ISP out there that would say, if this RPKI infrastructure exists, I'm going to start filtering my peers based on this, and you won't get routed on my network if you don't register your routes?
With a very small enhancement, I actually would like to start a public conspiracy that, well, okay, we figure out a simple way to for people to indicate that, well, okay, not only they have done their RPKI registration, but for this part of the address space, actually the RPKI, the RPKI is the only authoritative source.
Right.
If, say, our friends at Google register their stuff this way, and Citibank figures out they care for their address space, and well, okay, some other people, and well, okay, maybe they actually care as much about the address space to go through some pain to register it. So I would be quite certainly willing to do origin validation, and I would expect that some of the other major networks probably would join me.
Richard?
Well, the point that I would make is that origin validation only has a limited viability. It solves a certain problem. It solves a problem of accidental redistribution of a route, but it's trivial to spoof the origin AS on your AS path. Consider the scenario where I'm Sprint and I'm peering with level 3 and I receive a route for YouTube, and that route could have come from Google, who then who serves YouTube. It could have come from someone else behind level 3. When you get to this high level of tier 1s talking to tier 1s, you really don't know what's the full path on this. And origin validation only buys you so much.
Let me ask you, I would submit that if one large ISP, one tier 1 that provides trans and has lots of good connectivity, said, I'm going to filter everyone explicitly based on RPKI and IRR data, right? And started doing that, and you didn't get connectivity through that network, everyone would have to register everything, and then the routing system would be more secure.
Sure, but what ISP is going to do that? I mean,
No, that's a
they're
good
shooting
question.
themselves in the head. If
I heard Rudiger say he would
Well-
do some of that, actually.
Well. The thing is, if we find a way, and I'm sure it's pretty easy, to actually have parties who care about their address space, and to indicate that they have done the full registration, allowing everybody to do the origin validation. Will not remove all the other fake routes, but it helps to eliminate the fake routes like the YouTube event. And Richard, I completely agree with you. Yes, this is an idea that is easily undermined. On the other hand, again, if you want to have true security, we need the protocol. For the time until we get there, we have to work with heuristics and approximations. And I think offering a way for people who care about their address space will help. And by the way, it immediately can help our deaggregation problem, because one of the arguments we know that people say we are deaggregating to the longest prefix possible is because they say we do not want to get hijacked.
Right.
If we install origin validation this way, actually the origin validation will say, this /20, is it? Nothing longer will be accepted from anybody. And it may be that lots of service providers don't do the protection, but some parts can do, and I guess in the long run, actually the parties who care will actually give some benefits back to those parties who are creating a more secure internet.
Right. So let's take a couple of questions, and I got one more question about this. So the mic, say your name, please.
Daniel Medina. So a lot of this sounds like a lot of discussion that was going on with anti-spam efforts, where you had people publishing their SPF records, where you have, this is my domain and these are the IP addresses that are allowed to send mail traffic from it. And there you did have a big provider, AOL, who had who put pressure along with some others to get people to publish those records. And maybe one interesting feature there was that you had the option of, you could have a soft fail and a hard fail, where when you're publishing your information, it's informational or it's absolute, right? And then you use that as a weight to decide what you want to do.
So that's one of the things actually sort of illustrated in this diagram, is that you apply preference, be it some local pref thing or something else, to folks that have registered their routes, and you can verify based on that. So I agree. I agree with the analogy you're making. And in my mind, it takes one of the big ISPs to step up and say, I'm going to, once this infrastructure is in place, I'm going to make sure I have the tools and mechanisms, and I'm going to filter because my customers are going to be more secure. And if I filter you based on, if bilaterally we engage in this filtering, and you're more secure and I'm more secure from that, there's incremental gain in this.
And so the headway that was made there makes me wonder, was spam more serious than route hijacking, or why, why is the lack of traction?
That's,
It
that's
could
a
partly
good
be the
question.
tools,
No,
because you
absolutely.
publish MX records, so publishing a text record isn't such a big headache. but advertising routes, you don't actually have the tool infrastructure to, to publish your information easily.
So, I don't know, a comment here. Let's be brief with comments because we got about 10 minutes left, and I want to take these last two questions. But let's, Rudiger, Warren, somebody want to respond to that? No one's
Well,
touching.
okay.
Let's.
If-
go ahead.
Yeah. If the question was, well, okay, do we have a way to actually publish the good information? Yes, the RPKI will be the way. And we know how to translate the RPKI thing so that we get it available for reading by the existing RPSL-based tools.
I agree. Okay. Question over there. Is your name, please?
Sriram from NIST. We are doing a project at NIST currently where we are looking at both registry data as well as trace data from route views and riperies. I just want to emphasize the importance of completeness and consistency in the registries. We are looking at that data from the point of view of how algorithms would perform. Earlier today, PGBGP was mentioned, FAS was mentioned, so, and Nemesis was mentioned. So we are taking all those different kinds of algorithms and doing some enhancements on them, and also looking at a hybrid algorithm which makes use of both the registry data and also the historical data. So what we are finding is that, yesterday I gave a talk, incidentally, in the R&D session. The topic was BGP anomaly detection and robustness algorithms. So the primary thrust in the talk was to be able to do the prefix origin validation. And in order to do that, what we find is that even the best of the registries, for example, RIPE, RIR, and IRRs, if you look at, we looked at 6 months worth of history data and took all the prefix origins from there. And if you ask the question, what percentage of them are registered, and first of all, what percentage of them are stable and what seem to be unstable, based on a 48-hour stability criteria, we determined that 92% are stable and about 8% are unstable. That will vary depending on what data you pick, but the key point I want to make is once you they separate that into stable and unstable prefix origin pairs, and then you look at the registry, RIPE IRR and RIR being pretty good registries, better than the rest of the registries.
Okay.
So we went to that, and basically what we find is that the stable prefixes, 75% of them are registered and 25% are not registered. And if you look at the unstable prefixes,
can you wrap it up?
yes, sure. Okay. If you look at the unstable prefixes, they're like about 10% of them are registered. So variety of.
So I think this is really interesting data, and it's going to be important when people start doing policy on this. So if you have pointers or something, maybe to NANOG list or the like. But I think this is really interesting because before people implement policy and drop clauses or whatever based on this data, then they're going to have to understand what the what the characteristics of it. What are they going to break if they employ policy like this? So I think that's really important. So
yeah, I think it will help the RPKI, and anything that can be done to improve the quality of the registries will greatly help these algorithms.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
So Brian, you get 30 seconds to make your point, and then Tony,
20 seconds.
or ask your question, whichever you like.
Local preference, I'm Brian Dixon. Local preference is a very powerful tool, and it provides a great level of granularity, 250 plus levels of granularity. If instead of filtering out to completely drop, a number of different levels of local preference could be applied, where the best is RPKI, the next best would be RIPE, et cetera, based on where filtering information comes from. If everybody were to do that right now, and based on even empty filters, if it falls through to the end, and you just simply lower the local preference, that creates an incentive for everybody to register, because registering anywhere will provide some kind of defense against leakage or hijacking. Because if it's being leaked and it's not matching a registration, it gets lower local preference throughout
The one argument to that is that if it's a more specific, but I agree in general with you, if it's the same prefix length and it's leaked, I completely agree with that. And that's actually what some of the RPKI stuff is like, that's what this is meant to illustrate actually, is you provide preference to these other routes. So I think it's a great point to illustrate.
And, yeah, adding on to the filtering, possibly where there is a filtering entry to deny more specifics.
Yeah.
Which
good
is
point.
one
Good
place
point.
we drop, and
Yep.
obviously get rid of bowguns.
Sure.
So one quick comment about the performance impact on routers. You know, if you're no longer talking about generating a prefix list, you're now talking about generating an AS path filter list. You need to consider the performance impact of this because you're now basically doing a regex match. And yes, you can optimize that and you can tokenize the value out for some level of matching for the origin AS, but right now that isn't done. And if you end up trying to match many thousands of routes with an AS path filter on many peers, you're going to destroy your routers currently.
Tony.
Just on a also pragmatic note, how big are the biggest prefix filters people have now, and have they encountered customers with more prefixes than they could make into a prefix filter and work?
So I think the question, yeah, what are the largest filters anybody's deployed, and have you ran into any deployment problems or implementation problems because of the size of those?
Well, I think well, okay, we are actually filtering all customers and, well, okay, the smaller peers, including some US peers that are even in the room. We have prefix filter lists of a couple thousand lines. When router vendors create new software, once in a while they don't keep in mind that actually filter lists of this size happen, but they hopefully learn quickly. Yes, there are cases where it doesn't really work. I can tell you it would not be possible to build a filter for us. And, well, okay, of course, doing a filter for Sprint or level 3 wouldn't make any sense, except the negative filter of saying something like the origin validation.
I think Brian, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to comment on biggest filters. Back when I was at Telglobe, we built a filter for 701 as well as for Sprint.
Is this like an order of magnitude? Is it 10,000, 100,000?
50 to 100,000.
In routers you had at the time?
Yeah, 7600s, 7500s, and GSRs. We ran into a huge problem where the configs had to be put on flash, and writing to flash was taking 20 minutes. But that was a vendor implementation thing. We actually told them how to fix it, and it went down to 20 seconds to save a config.
Okay, good data point. Thanks. Any more brief comments on this, and then I'll go to Kevin in the back. 1 second.
Well, okay. I think if we figure out that the community is going to make some effort for doing tighter filtering, we also should be singing to our vendors that, well, okay, hey guys, the profile of the typical configuration is changing, and you should be doing something before our boxes break.
I agree. Yep. I think it's Kevin, right?
We do fairly aggressive, Kevin over in the ESNet, we do fairly aggressive filtering of a lot of our, I'll use the term smaller advisedly peers, and we have a number of access lists in all of our peering routers that are several thousand lines long, the longest ones being around 15, 16,000 lines, for total lengths of the prefix filtering access lists, sometimes in the order of 40 to 50,000 lines, both Junipers and Cisco 7600s, 6500s, 7200s, and they all seem to be able to handle it if you turn on certain features and tweak certain things and holler at Cisco occasionally.
Okay, good. Thanks for the data point. So we got about 3 minutes left, 2 minutes. Anybody have any last comments here before I summarize and we wrap it up? So, so I guess, the one thing that I wanted to highlight, and I think the thing that's really changed fundamentally, is the fact that, again, there's never really been any formally verifiable, source for who owns what IP addresses. And this RPKI thing, if you're not paying attention, Jeff Houston, I think, gave a presentation a couple of NANOGs back. It's in the index of, the talk index on the NANOG site. talking about what it is, and there's lots of implications and things wrapped around it, but it provides that sort of egg and, the chicken and egg problem. It's like there's no source, and I can't implement it because of this. So that, to me, is a game changer and allows people to start, looking at deploying this kind of policy. The router vendors, I think that, they're going to have to pay attention, and there's going to be a lot of infrastructure out there that's not going to be able to do this for a while. And then, the other thing is the ISPs really have to step up. The fact that some don't filter customers today, to me, doesn't seem like something, I don't think there's a viable excuse for that. I know mistakes happen, and those happen on the backbone side, so it doesn't matter if you're filtering customers or not. And, that also has the implicit side effect that you trust the rest of the internet, and their route announcements to you more than you trust your customers, so you're explicitly filtering your customers. So anyway, I think that there's a lot to be done. I personally would love to see a big ISP invest some time in this, like Deutsche Telekom and some of these folks are obviously very involved with this. I know Ruger and others have been, and say, I'm going to start filtering peers based on, explicitly based on this data because this infrastructure is going to exist. Obviously, there's a lot of stepping stones to that and a secure routing protocol, but, given that the infrastructure is going to be there, you guys should all be paying attention. So, any final comments from anyone?
Yes. I really would like you to encourage talking and influencing the policy and operation of your RIR, that when they do the RPKI, they don't wait a long time, and they create the user interface that will actually enable you and your customers to register your stuff. That's going to be difficult, but it seems to be about the only way for getting good data and helping us out of the mess.
One final pointer there. Yeah, one final pointer is that some of this stuff is happening in the IETF SIDR, SIDR working group. And so if you're interested in RPKI at all, either go have a look at Jeff's slides or come participate on that mailing list. We would welcome more operator feedback on that. So that's it. Thanks a lot. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.